We are fortunate enough to have one of the top medicine shows here on Pod TV, and I've got a great gentleman that is definitely part of what goes on in terms of understanding what's taking place, and is definitely an expert in infectious diseases and all along those lines. I'm gonna bring in my good friend and a new friend, Michael Patmos, who's got a lot of different things that he wants to talk about. But as far as I'm concerned, and I'm one of the main people in terms of production and in terms of programming here on the network, this is definitely one of our shows that is very informative, gives a lot of good information, and as far as I'm concerned, it's definitely one of the shows that is popular. And if it's not popular, it needs to be even more popular because you bring out a lot of very important information and all along those lines. So definitely glad to be here with you, Dr. Patmos. I'm gonna turn it over to you because I know you've got all kinds of interesting things that you want to discuss and everything. And then once you're done, me and Rick will probably join you later on as well. But definitely just glad to be able to provide a little bit of introduction to you and everything. But as you know, I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm always glad to be in your presence and learn from you and all the things that you've been finding out in the science world.
Well, good morning, Mark, and thank you so much for those extraordinarily kind words. I truly appreciate you and your friendship and the opportunity to appear on this program. For the viewers, just to remind them, I'm a board-certified internal medicine physician with added qualifications in infection control and hospital epidemiology. I've served on the faculty at 3 different medical schools, and I continue, even though I am semi-retired, I continue to practice medicine every day. Just a few hours a day, primarily with telemedicine. So I keep an active, clinically active every single day. So today's topic was actually suggested by Nick Palavita, your associate, and it sprang from the news report just the other day that Dr. Joseph Ladapo, the Surgeon General for the state of Florida, issued a very stunning recommendation against COVID vaccination for seniors. That goes against every recommendation from anyone else, and it just is jaw dropping, really. So the suggestion was, well, let's understand a little further about who Dr. Ladapo is and try to understand where these recommendations are coming from. So that's what today's topic is. For those who don't know, Dr. Ladapo has issued since he's been Surgeon General of Florida, a number of really odd, divergent recommendations that are completely inconsistent with anything else that any other reputable medical organization would make. For example, I just told you he recommended against COVID vaccination for seniors. He has recommended against COVID vaccination for children. He has recommended that parents decide for themselves whether or not their children should follow measles quarantine guidelines, basically allowing parents to send children exposed to measles to school. We know that what happened there was an outbreak of measles in Florida, and it spread to something like 13 other states. And as of right now, this year, we're almost at 300 measles cases across the United States. Much of that was probably started or spread by the outbreak in Florida. He has also opined against vaccination in general. He has opined in favor of unproven therapies, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and he has disparaged and repealed recommendations for quarantining children exposed to COVID and against masks and social distancing. Basically, in the last couple of years, Dr. Ladapo has issued a number of proclamations that are completely against what all the other infectious disease experts around the world would recommend. These aren't just minor differences of opinion. This is extreme going against the grain. It's so extreme. Let me give you some analogies. Imagine if a doctor came out and said, I recommend you do not use your seatbelts and disarm your airbags. Or I recommend that you not get prophylaxis against rabies if you're bitten by a rabid bat. Or I recommend that if you have HIV, you don't take any HIV medicines, just go out and have fun. Or I recommend if you have syphilis or tuberculosis or gonorrhea, don't worry about it. Just live your life normally. Don't treat it. That's how outrageous. Those are just examples. He's not said those things. I'm giving them as examples of how far off base his recommendations are. They're extremely off base. So much so that leading reputable organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Center for Disease Control have issued very strong condemnation of Dr. Ladapo's proclamations as Surgeon General of Florida. It's unheard of. No one in any responsible position of authority has ever recommended anything like what he's recommending. And it really puts the people of Florida at risk. So the question became, well, who is Dr. Ladapo and where did he come from? So in my career, I've had a number of roles where I was responsible for recruiting doctors for organizations. And I recruited over 200 doctors in various hospitals and health systems. And I've read thousands of resumes, and I've learned to be pretty good at reading resumes. And I enjoy reading resumes because I can pick out some of the odd things. Well, I've reviewed Dr. Ladapo's resume, and it's very impressive. Just to quickly go over it, he got his bachelor's degree from Wake Forest in chemistry. He graduated from Harvard Medical School in 2008. Along the way, he spent 1 year in a Master's of Public Health program at Harvard, but he dropped out of that and switched over to the PhD program. So he has an MD degree and a PhD in health policy. He's not an epidemiologist. His undergraduate degree is in chemistry, so he has an MD and a PhD in health policy. He did his residency in internal medicine at a spectacular place, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, one of the foremost training hospitals in the world, and he got board certified in 2011. After that, he went to NYU, where he was an assistant professor and had clinical teaching responsibilities at Bellevue and Tisch Hospital in New York. Bellevue's that's a pretty rough place to work. And he was an assistant professor there, meaning that he attended on the wards and supervised the team of interns, residents, and medical students. In 2000, after basically 5 years at NYU, he then took a role at UCLA, where he was an associate professor in residence. This is primarily a research position. And he had that role for 4 years, and then surprisingly was promoted to associate professor with tenure in 2020 after only 4 years as an associate professor. That's very fast to get to be associate professor with tenure, but kudos to him. He got a tenured faculty position at UCLA in 2020. Now, for those who don't know what tenure means, it means you can't be fired unless unless it's for cause. So unless you do something terrible like break the law or commit some crime of moral turpitude, that's a guaranteed job for life. As an associate professor at UCLA, probably would have made it up to full professor in a few years. That's a pretty nice thing to have. But he left. He left abruptly in 2021 to assume the role of Surgeon General at Florida. And how did that happen? Well, he's a prolific writer. He's written lots of papers, scientific papers, mostly having to do with cardiovascular disease and health economics and health policy, nothing in infectious diseases. He has no training in infectious diseases beyond what you get in internal medicine. He's not an infectious disease doctor. He doesn't have training in infection control. He's not an epidemiologist. He's not a microbiologist. He's not an immunologist. He has very little clinical experience. His work has mostly been writing papers. And he's written a lot of papers. But around 2020, when COVID hit, he started writing op-eds for the Wall Street Journal. And his op-eds were all anti-mask, anti-vaccine, anti-distancing, anti-lockdown, anti-everything. And those op-eds came to be noticed by Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who must have gotten together with him, spoke with him, and offered him a job as Surgeon General of Florida. Now, in order to sweeten the pie, Governor DeSantis must have promised him a professorship with tenure. So he would go a notch higher than he was at UCLA, from associate professor with tenure to full professor with tenure at Florida. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And I posted about this today on my LinkedIn profile. There's a document I found from the University of Florida College of Medicine, from the faculty there. And they're expressing grave concern over the process. Apparently, his application for a faculty position, professor with tenure at University of Florida, was rushed through in a week. And the faculty didn't really have much of a chance. They really didn't even get a chance to interview him. He had like one Zoom call. And before they even had a chance to vote about his appointment, he was already notified of his appointment with tenure before the faculty, basically just subverting the traditional role of the faculty in these appointments. It's unheard of for someone to come in from the outside and be given a full professorship with tenure, like in a rush like that in a week. That process normally takes a long time, and usually you have to be there for a while before you'll get tenure. This was rushed through, and it was all pushed through by the provost at University of Florida, who happens to be the provost and chancellor, which is a political appointee of Ron DeSantis. So it's fascinating. The letter from the faculty at the College of Medicine at the University of Florida is really disturbing to read. And I would urge you to, you can find it on my LinkedIn profile. I just shared it this morning. It's a fascinating document. And it's really disturbing because it just circumvented the whole process. And subsequently, so now Dr. Ladapo is Surgeon General of Florida, a professor at the medical school there. He's never there. The faculty are complaining they've only seen him twice on the campus. He bought a $1.7 million house in South Florida, South Pasadena, Florida, on the water, beautiful home. That's like nearly 200 miles away from where his job is at the medical school. So it's clear he has no intention of really working at the medical. This is just a paper position where he just collects a paycheck and shows up. He can't be fired because he's got tenure. You wonder, how did this get rammed through? What were his references? Well, fascinatingly, his boss at UCLA refused to recommend him. She gave a negative review. This is his direct supervisor at UCLA saying that she had concerns about she lacked confidence in his ability, honesty, and integrity. How do you get a full professorship with tenure at the University of Florida when your supervisor at UCLA said, I have confidence in his ability, honesty, and integrity? This was a political thing. He was pushed through by the governor to basically, because of his perspective on COVID, and it aligned politically with what Ron DeSantis wants, which was to use this as a political strategy to gain leverage and gain popularity with a base of hardcore conservatives and try to run for president, which he tried unsuccessfully to do. For Dr. Ladapo, it's a big step up. He probably doubled his salary, and he went from living in a 2-bedroom high-rise apartment in LA to a beautiful 4-bedroom oceanfront waterfront home in South Florida. So it's a big step up for him in lifestyle for him and his family. I don't begrudge that. God bless him. I'm glad he has a beautiful house. But I'm very concerned when a physician would go against all the other recommendations made by every other responsible authority and be rewarded for it with an important role as Surgeon General and a full professorship with faculty at a medical school, when the faculty didn't even get a chance to express. I mean, they expressed concerns in anonymous emails. You can see them in that report. One other thing that Dr. Ladapo has done that really raised a red flag for me is he authored a paper about COVID, which has really been soundly criticized for manipulated data. I mean, basically fudging the numbers to make it look like there's more side effects than there is. That's research and scientific misconduct, and it represents a lack of integrity for anybody to do that. So that's what I found about Dr. Ladapo. My concern, of course, is he's a high flyer in the world of anti-vax physicians. There are a few others, and interestingly, they all have something similar. If you study their backgrounds, they all have issues of integrity, honesty, research integrity, exaggerated, embellished resumes, kind of odd transfers from one place to another. All their resumes have red flags. His only really red flag in his resume is the fact that his faculty professor wouldn't recommend, his supervisor wouldn't recommend him. So that's basically what I have for today. Oh, my concern, of course, is should we end up with Trump being reelected, Dr. Ladapo could have a much greater role at the federal level. He could easily be appointed by Trump as a U.S. Surgeon General or at some other prominent role and have grave power to completely undermine the public health infrastructure and our vaccination efforts in the United States, which is already being undermined. He would just make it much worse. The worst thing that could happen would be for Dr. Ladapo to do to the country what he has done to Florida. So that's my report for today, and I'm happy to discuss it.
A couple of things that you brought up. I think Rick's got a question and everything, but you mentioned the Surgeon General. I know there's even been some conversations about the Surgeon General and the Surgeon General warning around social media and things like that. But for those that are watching the show and are interested, in your mind, how important is the Surgeon General, and how much should we pay attention to what the Surgeon General says, whether that's about cigarettes, whether that's about social media, or a number of other things that people sometimes want to label on? And a lot of times, the only time people think about the Surgeon General is when they pick up a package and see what the Surgeon General said on said package and everything. So I just wanted your thoughts around the importance of the Surgeon General.
The Surgeon General isn't just a titular perfunctory title. It's the most senior important physician in the United States. And you think back to great surgeon generals like C. Everett Koop, who really helped to expose the risk of tobacco in this country. And other surgeon generals, it's a very, very important role. And it has to be vetted through Congress and voted on by the Senate. And it's extremely important that no physician should ever be in that role where there's any questions about their integrity, ability, and honesty. So for him to end up in that role would be terrifying to me as a physician.
So here's some more stuff about Ladapo. He's a liar. When he became Florida Surgeon General, he claimed to have worked with COVID patients at UCLA. UCLA says no, he never worked with any COVID patient. And so let's talk about the human cost of his and DeSantis's policies. Now, the good and bad news about DeSantis is he's term limited out as of January 2027. COVID isn't the only way that DeSantis has been terrible for Florida. If you look at their homeowners insurance issues, where you can't get insurance, or if you can, it's $11,000 a year. But back to Ladapo and DeSantis's COVID policies. The vaccine became available about a year in March and April 2021, after we'd had COVID running wild for a year. But in Florida, the policy was, don't worry about it. Don't mask. Florida's for freedom, which meant that since that time, since a year after COVID, Florida has had a COVID death rate that is 220% of California's death rate, which amounts to 60,000 Floridians who died of COVID who didn't have to if they'd had more reasonable policies. Also, one more thing. You talk about the great Barrington Declaration. This is a declaration that says lunatic doctors say, don't take any precautions against COVID. Some vulnerable people might get sick and die. It's no big deal, and we'll have herd immunity. We are now in year 5 of COVID. It's been going for 4 2/3 years, and we don't have herd immunity.
Now, what we have is a human host reservoir of under and unvaccinated people who are continuing to replicate, mutate, and disseminate the virus. That's why it's not going away. You're right. So while Dr. Ladapo was at UCLA, his position was almost entirely research. He was required to attend on the wards several months a year. But what that means is he supervised interns and residents and medical students, and he didn't actually have patients assigned to him. It's not like he was a practicing physician. He was an attending on an academic medical service, which really the residents do all, and the fellows do all the work. The attending is kind of just comes around and makes rounds with them a couple times a week. Also, his supervisor at UCLA said another problem that she had with him was that he had a very hands-off policy when it came to interacting with COVID patients. So what I interpret that to mean is that when he was on rounds with the residents and there was a COVID patient, he wouldn't go in the room. The rest of it, you want to come and see the patient? He said, oh, it's okay. That's at least what I'm interpreting what she meant by a hands-off approach to dealing with it. As far as the deaths in Florida, you're right. Florida has something like approaching 100,000 deaths now from COVID, one of the worst performances in the country. And a lot of those were unnecessary and preventable deaths.
Now, if you go on Twitter, then the response from a defender of Ladapo will say, yeah, but they were old people. Florida has a lot of old people. And okay, A, garbage, because every state has old people. And B, I'm an old person. You're an old person. We're not expendable. We shouldn't be sentenced to death just because we're in our 60s or beyond.
You know, that's such a good point. I'm glad you said that, because they say all the time, well, they were elderly or they had comorbidities. Even the children, over 2,000 children in the United States have died of COVID. And when you bring that up, they'll say, oh, well, they had comorbidities. A question for you, do people with comorbidities have a right to live too? Are elderly people less important than middle-aged people and young people? And by the way, 20 to 30% of people who died of COVID are not elderly. So that's kind of like pushing the limit. Say, well, some people are just not worthy of being alive. That's an awful slippery slope to go into. So I don't know. I have grave concerns about Dr. Ladapo and the other people who are aligned with him. And they're really, I think what they're really doing, I guess they're either true believers, they honestly believe this misinformation, or they're basically just trading in their integrity and they're just basically trading in their ethics for income and lifestyle improvements. If you look at the net worth of the doctors who are proponents of anti-vax philosophies, and you go back a few years ago, their net worth has basically exponentially increased in the last couple of years. So they've really managed to leverage this anti-vax positioning for big increases in income and in economic fortunes for them. So I think that's what's driving it, and it's really, really sad because they're putting the public at risk. And that's the greatest thing about this, or the worst thing about this, is that it's putting the public at risk, for your own personal gain. His credentials, he's got such good training. How could he not know about measles? So either he's completely misled, or he's just doing it for his own economic enhancement purposes. But he's not an infectious disease doctor. He really ought to defer to the infectious disease doctors. And if he was credible, if I were in that situation, I would say, look, I'm not an infectious disease doctor. Let me defer to the infectious disease doctors at the University of Florida and the College of Medicine.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have been hired then by DeSantis, who was looking for.
Right.
But last week we were talking, two of the dirty dozen, the worst COVID misinformers. This couple they've made $100 million. Do you have $100 million?
No.
They made $100 million off of selling like garbage, cures and preventatives.
Yep. No, I'm just a little internist here. Never made big money. And,
Can I ask you? I have a booster question. So my wife and I try to time our COVID boosters for when we travel, because planes the air on a plane seems pretty clean, but the airports are. But anyway, but we can't do it every time we go someplace. Why can't? Would there be any sense to getting like a half booster just to remind your immune system?
I can't comment on that, Rick. I don't have data. I mean, it's just pure speculation on my part. I would have to defer to infectious disease experts about that. But what I can say is that there's a new vaccine that came available this fall that covers the current variant that's out there. This virus is mutating because there's so many people reproducing it. So the virus is mutating. I mean, only 20% of people in the country are adequately immunized against COVID. It means that 80% are just serving up themselves to be factories to make more COVID. So it's not going to go away ever if this continues like this. And by the way, the Great Barrington Declaration, that was cooked up in the Oval Office. I posted a photo of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration meeting with Trump to discuss it. They basically drafted that up as a defense for Trump's unraveling all the lockdown things. He didn't want the lockdown because it would hurt him politically. So he brought in these bottom dweller experts and had them craft up this Great Barrington Declaration, basically. So he gave him cover to say, oh no, we don't need, we're going to have herd immunity. Let them, we want them infected. The young ones will build up herd immunity, and only people who should be vaccinated the elderly. The Great Barrington Declaration, or GBD, I think it really stands for greatly benefiting.
Yeah, one more thing, like when you go on Twitter and argue with people and you talk about Trump's last year in office, 2020, which in a lot of ways was the worst year in US history since 1862.
Yes.
And they'll say, well, that's because of COVID. And then good luck arguing, well, that Trump botched COVID. But the deal is, 2 years before COVID hit in 2018, Trump disbanded the US's pandemic preparedness and rapid response team.
Bad timing. Yep, he did. He set us up for, and then the worst thing, and I look, I'm sure it was a terrible thing, to be in a position where, as a president of the United States, you've got to shut down the economy. And he didn't want to do that. And he resisted the recommend. At first, he went along with it for a week or two, and then he said, no, I can't go with this. And he booted out all the infectious disease experts, and he brought in all these other characters and said, give me something I can use to reopen the economy. And so he put his own reelection ahead of the public health. And as a result, over 1.2 million Americans have now died of COVID. We continue to lose roughly 1,000 Americans a week, 2 jumbo jets of dead Americans every week from COVID in this country. And of the 1.2 million who died, at least 300,000 to 400,000 died needlessly because they refused to be vaccinated, because he put doctors in charge who are anti-vax. I am terrified that if he gets back in there, he's going to put all these he's going to put these anti-vax doctors in government, and they're going to start basically going after doctors who vaccinate patients. They're going to force people.
Well, he has this new proposal called Make America, or this stance called Make America Healthy Again, MAHA, to go with MAGA. And RFK Jr. is deeply involved with that. And RFK Jr. is responsible for the measles deaths of hundreds of people, including dozens and dozens of kids on what island? New Guinea or
Guam, I think.
He comes in there, he says, yeah, don't worry about measles. And the vaccine is
Samoa. No, it was Samoa.
Right. So he tells Samoa, don't vaccinate against measles.
Right.
And they don't. And hundreds of people die.
Robert F. Kennedy is a lawyer. He's not even a doctor. He has no training in this. Ladapo has no training in infectious diseases. None of the anti-vax physicians are trained in infectious diseases. I mean, imagine if you had a doctor who wasn't a cancer specialist going on TV and advising the world about what to do about cancer. He's not even a cancer doctor. What is it about infectious diseases that we allow just anybody to make proclamations as if they're an expert? Infectious diseases is a specialty. You have to do a fellowship in infectious diseases to be an infectious disease doctor. Yet infectious disease doctors are just completely marginalized, vilified, and silenced. They're the ones who are being censored, not these anti-vax doctors. And oh, by the way, all of these anti-vax characters had a rally in Washington on Sunday to reclaim the Republic, and Robert F. Kennedy was a major speaker. Many of them were, oh, by the way, just happened to be guests and hosts of Tenet Media, which was just named by the Department of Justice for being funded by Russia, with Russian editors embedded at Tenet Media under alias. So isn't this interesting that we have this Russian-funded disinformation propaganda front called Tenet Media, contracted with podcasters and YouTube influencers who have guess who on their programs? Anti-vax doctors. It's just
60 years ago, Nikita Khrushchev, who ran the Soviet Union at the time, said, "We will defeat you without ever firing a shot."
We will bury you.
And it's doing it
they killed more people here than they did in Ukraine by just promoting anti-vaccination. But we're at the half hour, so we're going to have to go. But we do want to thank Dr. Patmos, board certified in internal medicine, Rick Grosner, member of the Mega Society, and the people in the United States for watching the show, and also the people around the world who watch Medicine and Science. And we will see you next week. Take care until then. Bye-bye.